Hello, and welcome to APSA's Backchannel, conversations with sexual abuse prevention experts. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Scott Melzer on the topic of masculinity and manhood. Dr. Melzer joined Albion College in 2004 after completing his BA in sociology at the University of Florida and his master's and doctorate in sociology at the University of California at Riverside. He currently serves as the W.W. Deal Trustees Professor of Sociology and Chair of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Albion College in Michigan, where he teaches courses on gender, social psychology, and criminology. He co-founded and serves as co-director of Albion College's Inside Out Prison Exchange program. His research examines men and masculinities, violence, and gun politics. He has written about men's violence against women partners, the NRA, and the gun rights movement, fight clubs, men's sexual size and performance anxiety and workouts, and the breadwinner dilemmas of unemployed men and stay-at-home dads. Dr. Melzer's work focuses on how men respond when they think their status and identities are threatened. He's the most recent author of a book entitled Manhood Impossible, which is a great book on his study of masculinity, men involved in fight clubs, in clubs regarding their penal size or sexual performance anxiety, and those who are outside of the breadwinner societal expectation. It is our pleasure to welcome Dr. Melzer to APSA's Backchannel. So thank you for joining us, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
So let's start our conversation with a question about how you came to study masculinity.
You know, it was the convergence of a number of things, biographical life experiences and academic training. I more or less grew up in the suburbs in South Florida, and I was pretty traditional in many ways as far as a young boy participating in sports. I excelled as a young child, and then eventually everyone hit puberty and grew up well before I did, and I was pretty small for quite a long time. I'm now about average height for an American man, but I was pretty small, and that really colored my experiences going through high school and being at the back end of the curve there. And so I had some cultural capital from being coordinated and athletic, playing basketball, but at the same time, I was, much smaller than the other boys and didn't have a dating life until the end of high school, and was kind of fearful of some of those other bigger boys, even though I didn't make a lot of enemies. And I think that combined with, over the course of my childhood and especially my adolescence and youth, that there were a number of girls and women in my life who had experienced various forms of what we would call intimate partner violence, psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, stalking, harassment, etc., all at the hands of boys and men. And so there were a troubling number of those experiences to, again, the girls and women in my life, family, friends, and classmates, and friends, and later girlfriends, etc. And I went off to college and was studying both psychology and sociology, and eventually took a course that today would be called something like Men and Masculinities, and really started connecting all the dots about what it means to be a man really explains a lot of the violence that men perpetrate against themselves and others, especially girls and women. And I got involved with a peer education group that taught these kinds of issues, and so that kind of got me down the path, and eventually into graduate school, where it became my focus, my scholarly focus, my research and teaching have revolved around gender and masculinity first and foremost.
Thank you. it's one of the striking things is that also being male is interesting how you're studying things that you are part of. And it's in reading your book also, it's there are times where the mirror was there and made me think about my own masculinity. And I tend to think about that a lot because of my status as a Latino male. The older I get, the more liberal I get, and the more laid back I get about gender and all kinds of things. But still, there are I see the grasps of patriarchy and the masculinity, the masculine expectations, like grabbing me in the back. With respect to those expectations, what do you see as society's main expectations for men, and how do we go about fulfilling them?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, but of course we get paid by the word. I think to be a man in the United States today and in many other parts of the world is, to demonstrate that you're first and foremost not a girl or a woman. That is, masculinity is constructed in opposition to femininity. If you want to put down a boy or a man, the first words that come out are attached to girls, women, and femininity, right? All those pejoratives, those cutting, scathing pejoratives. And so you have to establish yourself as not feminine. And I think the second thing that we can identify is that masculinity also is something that you have to demonstrate and prove. It's got to be displayed regularly. So I think it's tenuous, and it can be attacked and minimized and in some ways eliminated. So no matter what my recent record is as an athlete, as a breadwinner, as a leader, a boss, etc., if I do something that fails to fulfill masculinity or manhood, then my status is under threat in that moment, and maybe going forward. Suddenly people may question whether I am a real man. So it's tenuous and needs to constantly be proved. And then the third sort of aspect or feature of masculinity, I think that we need to identify, is that masculinity is valued. Masculine typed traits, characteristics are valued by our society. So to be a leader, a boss, to be independent, self-reliant, to be in control, assertive, tough, strong, dominant, those are all things that our society values. And the things that we attribute to femininity and womanhood, to be caring, nurturing, kind, dependable, maybe a little dependent, etc. Those are things that our society devalues. We just have to look at the kinds of careers and how they're rewarded in our society, as well as, again, those individual characteristics. So there's a lot at stake for men to try to maintain their masculine statuses and identities. And I think at the heart of manhood is control, and that it's really on men to exhibit, and boys to exhibit control over themselves, their bodies, over their emotions, and to also resist others exerting control over them. So they shouldn't be subject to others' whims and control. And if they are, then again, they've lost some sense of status and identity. And in my research, I think I and others as well have identified that men's bodies and their breadwinner status are the two primary sites of men's control. So like what matters most to boys and men, their bodies, especially when they're younger, before they're able to assert a kind of breadwinner identity, before they're making enough income to do that. And then later on, indeed, that breadwinner status matters, not to say the body stuff goes away. So if they can, again, exert and resist control of their work and their bodies, then they're in a strong position. Now, of course, this idea that masculinity is tenuous, it needs to constantly be proved, that reveals it as this hegemonic masculine ideal, this platonic ideal that no one can actually live up to. And so inevitably, all men are going to experience some sort of sense of failure, whether others are labeling them as failures in some way, or they just perceive it themselves. and that translates to all kinds of bad behaviors, essentially, that men are internalizing this sense of failure. So the system is rigged to make men want to strive to be on top. It's impossible to actually get there. It makes them feel insecure in various ways. So we're setting men up to be failures, but really specifically to be gender failures, right? So they're failing as men, right? It's one thing to fail, on some particular task, and like, well, I wasn't, a very good cook today. I made a bad meal, but that might not undermine my sense of femininity or masculinity. But for these characteristics, I think they often do for these ideals. So men are pursuing, status and power. That's what they're supposed to do. And the reality is few of them can achieve that. And I'd say even those who achieve a fair amount of it still don't really feel like they're particularly powerful in their daily lives.
Could that explain the massive mansions that we see?
Yeah,
so it's like a $300 million mansion. That's not enough.
Conspicuous consumption. There's always a bigger fish in the sea, right? There's only one person at any one moment, right, who's on top economically for this example. But again, that's tenuous too, right? Today the stock valuations are here, and tomorrow they're down there, and so it is sort of a constant battle. And again, we kind of joke about these things. But yeah, there's something to that, right? To exhibit that kind of wealth and status, to let everyone else know where you are, where you rank.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I come from a very competitive family, but as a result of that competitiveness, I kind of like shied away from all the competitiveness. So never had any problem losing. Like, all right, that's fine. But members of my family, whoa. So these expectations are very difficult for everybody, for every man. What becomes particular challenges for men who have perhaps lower opportunities or other challenges, like men of color, gay men, trans men? What are some particular challenges that they face?
Yeah, great question. Obviously, men's experiences with masculinity vary, right? We are all familiar at this point in time with the concept of intersectionality, and that gender alone can only explain so much. And sticking with just gender for a moment again, we know that men as a group enjoy more status, power, privileges, et cetera, than women as a group. But of course, not all men enjoy those equally, right? The access is not equal. So, I think if we look at the research on masculinity historically, gay men and more recently trans men have been subordinated, have been labeled as the least masculine, right? And oftentimes equated with women and femininity. There's that American stereotype in other countries as well, where gay men are essentially just women, right? There's the kind of campy gay stereotype where they're effeminate in ways that mark them as kind of non-men. Now, of course, those are breaking down some, but we have seen, gay men and trans men are fighting to assert their status as masculine men, as fully human males in the way that others are fully human trans men, depending again what status they identify as. So they've been subject, like women and girls have been, to a disproportionate amount of abuse, of harassment, of physical and sexual violence. For girls and women, it's mostly at the hands of intimates, of boys and men in their lives, boyfriends, husbands, partners, family members, classmates, you name it. Whereas for men, most of the violence that men experience comes at the hands of strangers. So we might think about street violence. So, gay or trans men walking down the street and being targeted by strangers, for example, or bar fights, or gang violence. We want to start to talk about men of color as well. But it's notable, just to stick with gay and trans men, that gender identity and sexuality, gender expression, those things, again, intersect with this concept of masculinity. And so I may identify as a cis man. I may have grown up that way, but if I am attracted to other men, then suddenly my status as a man may be undermined a bit, because men are not supposed to have sex with other men according to our cultural ideals. And we can dig into Latin America a little bit more, where there's this sort of specific norms around who, and I teach in prison as well, some of the same things, like who's doing the action versus who's receiving the action, so to speak, right? So there's one of my professors and mentors was Alfredo Miranda, and he wrote Hombres y Machos many years ago, and talked about this this concept, right, of like, if you're, am I allowed to curse in this podcast? I don't know what the rules are.
Sure, why not?
I'll clean it up here so I don't offend anyone. If you're doing the effing, then you're still in the position, the active masculine position, right, of action. And if you're doing the receiving, pitcher and catcher kind of stuff in prison, then you're gay. So it's not who you have sex with; it's what position one is in during the sexual act. And so those ideals. Again, in some ways, vary by culture, but still the idea of men like of being active rather than passive, right? Of being in the position of action rather than receiving.
I'm laughing because they have been having that argument in Latin America from colonial times. It was like, it wasn't that men were having sex. It was like, who was the giver, who was the receiver. And that was very important. And that includes priests. And we're still at it.
Yeah. And so, and just to come back to men of color a little bit more, if we look at, so again, I think gay men have been the most subordinated, and trans men are in a similar kind of cultural position, I guess, these days. And if we look at men of color, whether it's, Latinos or African Americans or other groups of men of color, we can just kind of walk through, as a sociologist, I would walk through these various social institutions to identify their status. And so for men of color, I'd probably start with the institution of the law or the criminal justice system, right? We're all probably familiar these days with mass incarceration, the disproportionate impact of policing and profiling on particularly African-American men, but Latinos as well. And what that translates to in their daily lives, their incarceration rates and so forth. Or we can look at the economy and work and see the huge disparities in income levels and wealth levels historically over time, looking at some of that residential racial segregation, look at educational disparities and the lack of funding of public schools and neighborhoods predominantly populated by men of color. So we can go on and see that those folks are having a much more difficult time gaining access to these masculine statuses and identities, because again, they're supposed to be breadwinners, and if they're socially, structurally denied opportunities, or at least many hurdles are placed in front of them to arrive at that breadwinner status, then all the problems that accompany failed masculinity are going to hit these folks harder, and that's exactly what we see.
So when our status is challenged, it can be very destabilizing, depending on the level. I would assume. How in your research, what have you found that men do in order to compensate for this seen probably insults to their self, their masculinity?
Yeah, my research, my book really focused on, how do men respond when they predictably fall short of these ideals, because they are, again, going to fall short. And I found 4 kinds of responses. One, the sort of precursor to most of the others, is they internalize a sense of failure. I should have done this, I should be able to do that. And so they feel like failures. And so that leads to internalized reactions. So it might be something like problem drinking or drug abuse, depression, in some more extreme cases, not taking care of themselves, weight gain or weight loss, hygiene issues, you name it. So they're internalizing that's their sense of failure. And sometimes separately and sometimes in conjunction with that, some men try to repair that perceived failure. They try to fix it. So I studied a group of members of a fighting club in the San Francisco Bay Area. And for a subset of these men, their biographies were that of being bullied and abused as boys, and that led them to usually martial arts and eventually to this fighting club as adults. And they were trying to exorcise those old demons by putting their bodies at risk in a more controlled environment, but nonetheless still dangerous enough because they were using various props like chairs and sometimes scary things like chains to fight each other, sometimes less scary things like dustbusters. And there's a comedic aspect to it. But at times that fight club, got very serious and potentially dangerous. And so it allowed those men to test themselves and to try to kind of repair their sense of failed and broken masculinity as youth. And then the last two things I think, we might end up focusing more on, as you mentioned, compensating. So another avenue in response to failed manhood is to try to compensate. So if I don't fulfill some aspect of manhood or masculinity, I seek out some other avenue and I assert myself there. It's like the college kid who's called a fag and he's says screw you, I can drink more than you, or I've had sex with more girls than you have, or etc. So they try to reassert themselves. And again, in the context of my research and probably the research in general, I think there are some innocuous responses like slipping into fantasies, fantasy game playing, fantasy role playing, reading books and so forth, where they imagine themselves to be someone else, and that's a way to compensate for their real world shortcomings. But alas, an all too common response is to engage in compensatory masculine violence. And that's been at the heart of my scholarship research interests. When I was an undergraduate taking this masculinities course, and then eventually in grad school became my master's thesis, I was studying men's violence against women partners. And I found that men doing so-called women's work, clerical support type jobs, had the highest rates of violence against their women partners compared to men of any other occupational group. So the men who were doing women's work, who were undoubtedly perceived as not real men because of the type of work and the incomes that were derived from it, were the ones most likely to engage in physical violence against their women partners. So I would argue that's a form of compensatory masculine violence. They fail in part as breadwinners. They reassert their masculine selves by engaging in violence against partners. And my more recent research, most recent book, identifies many mass shooters who also are clearly engaging in compensatory masculine violence. They were failures sexually in some ways. They struggled to date and attract women. They had this sense of entitlement that often accompanies masculinity and manhood, particularly for middle class and upper middle class men, particularly for white men. And if things didn't go as they expected, they found a way to reassert control in the most grotesque fashion by engaging in mass violence, oftentimes against strangers. That's not to say that every one of these mass shootings is an example of that, but some of them clearly are. Probably many of the listeners have heard of the term incels, involuntary celibates, these kids who, assume, expect, and wish that they were sexually active and aren't. And so we've seen a number of these folks really respond with a frightening level of misogyny against girls and women for their sexual failures. So again, in both cases, we have breadwinners in my earlier research who, we have failed breadwinners engaging in compensatory violence, and then we have folks who failed somehow with their bodies to assert themselves, in this case sexually, and they too sometimes compensate with frightening, problematic levels of violence.
I think that this will resonate quite a lot with our audience, because we see sexual aggression as being based on power and control, also as compensating We have many examples with in my clinical experience with adolescents where, you know, this 6 foot tall teenage boy offended against his, you know, like 7-year-old sister because she called him a name. And, you know, it's like, oh my, what can be going through your head that, you know, that really injures you so that you have to behave in that way. But we see the compensatory behaviors that you have seen with the violence, we see all the time with sexual aggression. Men who are not what the ideal of masculinity is, becoming child molesters. Almost to the point that I worked in a place where civilly committed men were there, and it's almost like you can make them out, like, you know, that person has the look of a child molester. Mm-hmm. And actually have seen a teenager in particular comes to mind, going from looking like a child molester and offended against a little boy in a fast food restaurant, undergoing a growth that involved acceptance of himself, acceptance of his sexual orientation with a very good clinician, to developing into a young man that didn't look like that anymore. It was really, really striking, but how he was able to redefine himself, and I would argue his sense of him as a male, and how he was able to get past that. But all of this will resonate very much with the audience because we see it all the time.
Yeah, and if I can just follow up with that a little bit, you know, again, I'm not a clinician, but you know, having worked in prisons a little bit, again, you see the displays of masculinity, discussions of masculinity that reflect these hierarchies and who's on top and who's on bottom, and even below gay and trans men at the prison that I teach at least are child molesters, you know, chomos in the parlance of that prison. And so the idea of victimizing, you know, the least among us, right? That's something that strips one of one's masculine identity. So you're supposed to be tough and strong and able to fight and kick ass and all those things, but if you do it against, you know, the weakest of the victims, so to speak, then you lose some of that status and identity. And again, I think it's so revealing of manhood because it's so easy to, again, to be shamed. And I you know, I think introducing the topic of emotions is important here too, right? Again, you know, and what's the expression? Like, embarrassment is a civilizing emotion, right? We do something to get a little bit embarrassed, but people, you know, essentially invite us back into the community still. Okay, I'm not supposed to do that way. But shame is like fundamentally undermining. I think it's James Gilligan who's written on this. And that leads to these really powerful, violent responses by a lot of men. They feel shamed for their physical, sexual, economic inadequacies. And that leads to these, in some cases, right, these raging, violent responses. And back to gender again, you know, we just don't really see that to the same extent with girls and women. Not to say that femininity isn't constructed in powerful ways, but it's kind of harder to undermine girls and women's femininity in such a way that they respond so powerfully. Girls and women are trained more, you know, rewarded more for internalizing their failures rather than externalizing, right, and taking that out on others. But the commensurate masculine violence is a very gendered phenomenon.
It's really it seems that girls and women have more of an allowable continuum of behavior and emotional experience and expression that women have, at least in this country. I like to blame my profession, psychologist, for getting all into the homophobic thing in the late 1800s and saying that it was a mental illness. And then all the photos of men holding hands from the 1800s disappeared. In the meantime, you have very stereotypically masculine men in Europe playing soccer and Latin America kissing each other when they're being subbed out. And I tell my students, you know, when I email or when I communicate with my friends in Mexico, the typical saying goodbye is, I'm sending you a very strong hug. And I asked them, what would you think your male friends would think if you send an email and you sign off with hugs, Frank? Which it's very, very interesting, given that my culture, Mexico, being very misogynistic and macho, but then again, there's a little bit more of a range of a lot of activity for men.
Yeah, more physical intimacy. Do they think if you sign off on hugs that it's a bro hug, you get like the hand clasp and then the reach around and tap on the back, or is it
no? In Mexico, there's a whole ritual, and you can confuse. I confused my father the first time I went back. He stayed back. You shake hands and then you do a full hug, but it's tapping. You tap and then you shake hands again. I haven't found any other Latin Americans to do this thing, but I mean, same thing with, in Saudi Arabia, you get the 2 kisses or the 3 kisses. So, but and given our time constraints, that leads us to where do we go from here? How can we address this individually? How do we get to what you call in your book, equality masculinities?
Yeah, first and foremost, we have to remember, again, gender is a social construct, right? It's artificial, it's arbitrary. You were just talking about how it looks different in one culture versus another. And so I think it's too easy to fall into the trap of this is, our essential selves and beings. And that's the kind of pushback that we often face from those outside of our circles. And I think with this younger generation, we're seeing a much greater interest and push for these kinds of equality masculinities. So we've been in some ways a little bit bogged down by the idea of hegemonic masculinity or hegemonic masculine ideals, and the idea that if anyone does gender in a way that's been historically considered inappropriate, that they're going to get bonked on the head and told you're doing it wrong and punished, and that's that. But the reality is, as Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, said, how does the world change? People change it. And so this younger generation is helping change things and asserting different ideals of manhood and masculinity. And they're coming from these intersectional approaches where they're, again, focusing on gender identity, sexuality, race, ethnicity, social class, disability, and so forth, and recognizing that manhood doesn't have to be competitive, manhood doesn't have to be destructive, and noting that even when men conform to these ideals, they're oftentimes harming themselves and others because the ideals are not egalitarian, right? They're not cooperative. So the men who succeed, often are victimizing others and sometimes themselves too. And so we see a range of men. It's not just young folks in my research. So a lot of the stay-at-home dads that I interviewed are pushing for alternatives to this breadwinner as ideal. They talked about themselves still in these very gendered this gendered language of saying, like, I'm the real man. Why? Because I'm sacrificing my career for my family. I'm prioritizing what my kids need, what my partner needs. And of course, those men were often class privileged. They had the opportunities and choices to make those decisions. But nonetheless, there are boys and men who are pushing back. And, it's obvious on its face for all those who have been suffering from victims of hegemonic masculinity, girls and women first and foremost, right? Of course, most of them would embrace these new equality masculinities. Gay men and trans men who've been the victim of so much of men's abuse and violence. Many, underrepresented and discriminated against groups of men, many men of color who, again, have not enjoyed the same kinds of economic access, who are subject to criminal justice abuses and so forth and so on. So, so there are costs to doing it well and doing it right, even when men do live up to some of these ideals. And again, the reality is most don't enjoy all those benefits or perceive that they're not, excuse me. So, so they may be up for constructing these safer, healthier, better alternatives for their own selfishly and others' physical and psychological and emotional well-being. They may be more prepared to kind of strip off their armor and live more fully human lives because they have been distancing themselves from that and denying that. And again, they and others around them are paying the price for that.
Well, we are out of time. I would like to thank you again for chatting with us. I would encourage our listeners to think about their own situation and that of those around them based on this conversation, and also to get your book so that they can get more detail about being in psychology and criminology. The idea of going into the field and joining what you're studying is scary as hell, let me tell you that. So when I read Fight Club, but having been involved in 2 fights in my life, both in 2nd grade, 50-50 record. So I think this is an important topic for all of us to think about, for ourselves and for others around us, so that we can all get on board with the little ones who are really leading the way now about how we can live in a better world, because God knows we have messed it up. And your book and this conversation actually gives me hope that things will be better. And I will leave it at that. So thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you so much. I'll look forward to mining your fighting history when we're offline.